Welcome to the NFL Week 3 wide receiver and cornerback matchup grades. I'm Jason Gilbo at jgilbo11. As always, you can find my article over on dailyfantasycafe.com, in-depth breakdown of all these guys and their individual matchup grades going into Week 3. We'll start with the blown coverage portion here. This is what I expect to be the best cornerback matchups of the week. We'll start here with A.J. Green. He is a hot topic of Week 3. Obviously, one of his lower salaries over on FanDuel at $7,500, 81 over on DK. Going to see a Green Bay secondary that's obviously very lackluster. They lack the elite corner to kind of shut down someone of A.J. Green's talent. I know Tyler Eifert's ruled out. I know John Ross is likely ruled out as well. This is a spot where A.J. Green's going to be the guy, going to be peppered with targets. Do we see something similar where Baltimore just basically blanketed A.J. Green in Week 1 and kind of made him useless out there? That's something that I think we need to kind of consider. I think we're all kind of turning a little bit of a blind eye and just looking at individually, A.J. Green against Devon House, A.J. Green against Demaryius Randall, two easy matchups for Green to dominate. I do think this is a spot where we need to see 10-plus targets for Green. Andy Dalton needs to get him the ball regardless. But like I said, if there's going to be a lot of safety help over the top, if he's going to be getting double covered, he could be in a little bit of a trouble this week. And I think we're kind of looking the other way on that. But I do like Green quite a bit. I am going to be using him pretty hefty. I'm falling for it, but I'm not going to be one to just kind of turn a blind eye and go, you know what? His floor is still very low in this offense with how it's performing, him being the only target. It's kind of, the same thing with Hopkins this week, who we'll talk about in a little bit. But you look at Randall, this is a guy who's been targeted 23% of the time, allowing 0.49 fantasy points per route run. Green's in a really good spot, heavy target share at these price tags. I do think you just fire away here. I'm okay with him in cash and GPPs. Let's move forward here. Demaryius Thomas, interesting spot for him. Denver traveling into Buffalo. This is a tough spot for anyone, traveling cross country into Buffalo. It's usually we see pretty good offenses drop off. Trevor Siemian obviously out there playing like freaking Joe Montana right now. That's not going to last really all that long. But Demaryius Thomas in kind of a good spot here against E.J. Gaines, who Buffalo traded for this offseason. E.J. Gaines, 0 point fantasy points per route run last year, target 20% of the time going back to last season. Offenses obviously look good so far. Thomas is an interesting play if you believe this one is kind of going to be a little bit of a not a shootout, but if Denver can put some points on the road here, it might turn into a little bit of a spot where Buffalo does have to chase. But kind of how I'm looking at this week, I think Buffalo and Denver is going to be very similar to how Carolina and Buffalo was last week. I'm not expecting a ton of production in the passing game, really on both sides. It's just a tough spot all around. So, sticking with AFC West wide receivers, Keenan Allen, good spot here. Phillip Gaines is a guy I do like to pick on. 0.40 fantasy points per route run allowed since last season. This is actually a sneaky spot for some good wide receiver options. Especially guys like kind of Travis Kelce, Keenan Allen, Tyrell Williams is an interesting GPP dart throw at best. I've seen people kind of talking him up. I'm not in love with it, but I think the potential's there. But I do like this game in terms of just overall lower ownership plays, just because it doesn't really appeal on this type of week. But Keenan Allen, obviously the price tag has really come up with 2 back-to-back strong weeks. I like him going into this week. Sam Bradford, this is a guy, I wrote the article, I was trying to getting stuff down over earlier in the week. It looked like Sam Bradford had a good chance to maybe get back on the field this week. That's not going to be the case here anymore. He's unlikely to play. Adam Thielen actually drew a pretty decent matchup against Robert McClain, who allowed over 0.35 fantasy points per route run since last season and an 83% catch rate. Those are very strong numbers for Thielen. I do think he's an interesting play this week. Obviously, you're going to downgrade, the Minnesota offense with Case Keenum in there, but I can't knock the matchup for Thielen. And if he's going to draw low ownership, I do think he's a decent look this week. A guy who I do like in GPPs, T.Y. Hilton, take on Jamar Taylor. Taylor's a guy who's just been a casual corner. Now he's the number 1 guy. Hilton's going to be someone who lines up all over against a group of corners that are in Cleveland. It just doesn't scare me. Hilton, 0.42 fantasy points per route run since last year. He's been one of the stronger wide receivers. I think this is a good week to stick him into a couple of lineups and kind of look for him to go off with Brissett there under center. I do like him quite a bit. OBJ looks to be healthy this week. If Eli Manning can get enough time to throw, OBJ will obviously be priority number one in this offense, and an offense that's been absolutely awful to start the year. Philly's secondary very banged up. Jalen Mills allowing it over a 2 yards per route run, 0.36 fantasy points per route run allowed against him. I'm not crazy about OBJ. I still want to see this offense get somewhat going. I think he's obviously a decent GVP guy. I'll walk back a little bit because I was kind of extremely off of him on the slate breakdown and in this offense in general. He's obviously the only one you can really touch at this point in this offense just because of the upside. But I'm not going to be going crazy at his high price tags. I still think paying up at wide receiver or at running back is going to be how I approach this week. But OBJ is certainly worth a look. Antonio Brown, obviously, getting a shot at the Bears here. They've kind of had the narrative of being guys who take away wide receiver ones. Brown's a different animal. Whether he's going to see Marcus Cooper, Kyle Fuller, those are guys that just aren't going to be appealing for me, that I'm going to be shying away from Brown. So I like going that route. I like Brown. I think the passing game is an intriguing GPP option because I think Bell's going to be the popular play from this offense, just given the spot that the Steelers are in. So I think he'll garnish a little bit lower ownership just because of the price tags and because how this week sets up. It's not like last week where we have all the value running backs that are kind of jumping out at everyone. I mean, Ty Montgomery, CJ Anderson, I know they're still cheap. Jay Ajayi is not even really that expensive. So, you can still fit these guys in there. But I don't think they're going to be crazy high owned, but they are decent spots. A few home run threat guys that I do like this week based on matchup. DeSean Jackson taking on Trey Waynes. Waynes is a guy I'm going to be picking on throughout the year. This guy just can't keep up with guys like Burns. We saw Martavis Bryant talked about him last week being in a good spot. DeSean Jackson is in that same spot with Xavier Rhodes, who's going to be shadowing Mike Evans. Waynes, he's been awful. 0.35 fantasy points per route run. The other side I'm looking at here is Brandon Cooks. Obviously, week 1 and week 2, haven't really seen a lot out of him. Week 1, he drew a lot of pass interferences. This is actually a sneaky spot here. Going to get Marcus Bailey for the most part. Houston a little bit banged up in that secondary. He's not an every down player. We see Tom Brady kind of see those exposures and pick on them. I think Cooks could be one of those guys this week, and because the price tag's down, 7,500 on FanDuel, 73 on DK, starting to drop with Cooks, kind of his down production over the first 2 weeks. So he's definitely an interesting dart throw. Like him as kind of pairing him with Brady, who I'm also high on this week. I just think he's going to get the job done against this Houston team. So definitely don't mind going that route. A couple of cheap guys here. Jermaine Kearse caught 2 touchdowns last week. Probably going to see a little bit of a bump in ownership. Going to see Xavier Howard, who's been kind of a mediocre guy. 0.34 fantasy points per route run since last year, 1.77 yards per route covered. Kearse is still fairly cheap. If he's going to get wide receiver 1 targets, I still think you kind of continue to look at him as the Jets are just going to be basically down all the time and they're going to be throwing. Kearse is going to continue to be a guy who I think you can take shots on as a wide receiver 3. One of the more popular value plays this week is Rashard Higgins getting a depleted Colts secondary. There were talks of getting some guys back like Vontae Davis. That's not going to be the case. This is still a secondary. It's going to be bottom 10. 11 targets for Higgins last week. Decent matchup here. Kind of interesting. We've seen kind of some news about Kenny Britt. I think Kenny Britt's probably the ultimate contrarian play and kind of a hedge off of Higgins. Obviously, DeShone Kizer, probably a popular value quarterback this week in the spot. But Britt's an interesting one. Obviously, they paid him a ton of money. Lots of down talk about him, just not really carrying the first few weeks. There's times where he just wasn't getting any snaps. The heart-to-heart talk, we can buy it, we cannot. But he's an interesting guy if you want to toss out there just because they're so limited. But I think obviously in the spot, you might be worth a look if you're kind of trying to be different. So let's move on to zone coverage here, kind of the middle tier. Devontae Adams going up against Adam Jones. No one really draws an extremely favorable spot out of these Green Bay wide receivers. Randall Cobb still banged up. Jordy Nelson not 100%. I'm curious to see how things trade up towards Sunday morning. Adams is going to draw. Adam Jones. It's not really that favorable a spot. Catch rate below 60%. I'm just not really worried based on those overall offense and Aaron Rodgers obviously being at home. So I'm not shying away from these guys. I think Adams is obviously an intriguing option, especially if one of the two dudes sit. But either way, I think he's in a good spot. 5,600 on DraftKings, nice price. 1,600 on FanDuel. I like the spot there. Staying in the NFC North, Julio Jones will draw Darius Slay in shadow coverage. This is a tough matchup. Obviously, Julio Jones is someone where he has the ability to beat anyone. He's just a freak athlete. He's a top 3 wide receiver in the NFL. When you factor in price, you start to kind of get down in this type of spot because you look at Slay. He's he's held opposing wide receivers to a 0.23 fantasy points per route run and also 55% catch rate, also under a 1 yards per route covered. I mean, those are very strong numbers for Slay, and Detroit was a decent spot against wide receiver ones last year. So I'm not all over Jones. I think he's an interesting play this week. I'm going to have some shares, but he's not a guy that I'm jumping all over like I was last week. Golden Tate, he's the same one that same game. Going to see a lot of Brian Poole in the slot. Poole kind of quietly got the job done in 2017 with a decent, slightly above average slot corners in the game. Did allow a 70% catch rate, but does limit a lot of yards. That is one of his strong suits. But I do like Tate in this offense. I do like Tate in this game, so I'm not really, worried about it too much. A couple of other slot guys, Danny Amendola, he's back practicing. Filled in nicely for Julian Edelman in week 1. Obviously missed game 2. He's a decent spot here. Kareem Jackson was actually someone I didn't mind targeting with above average guys here in good offenses and good passing attacks. 0.35 fantasy points per route run, 69% catch rate allowed by Jackson. Amendola will get a bump if Chris Hogan's out, who's questionable. I know Rob Gronkowski's questionable, but he looks like he's good to go. But Amendola's a decent spot here at a decent price tag. I think obviously this Patriots passing attack is going to be something we look at week in and week out. Jarvis Landry coming off a big week, points per reception-wise. We'll see Buster Screen in the slot. He's allowed a 1.15 yards per route covered, and F-rated corner per PFF. So definitely don't mind Landry. Devontae Parker's in a similar spot where I'll be firing away. I like both those guys. I like Miami just as a whole this week. Fire up those Miami stacks for sure against this team, even on the road. Moving to the NFC South, a matchup here, Michael Thomas. Kind of in a similar spot with Brandon Cooks where big expectations were coming in 2017. We didn't get a ton out of them in the first 2 weeks. Thomas is going to see, Darryl Worley. He got better as the season went on last year, under a 0.30 fantasy points per route run. Thomas is kind of more of a game theory play if you think New Orleans is going to be chasing this one from behind. I'm not exactly just, jumping all over this one thinking there's going to be a ton of fantasy points. And I could very well be wrong. I mean, we've seen in the past these two teams play, and there has been a lot of fantasy points. Because Kelvin Benjamin on the other side, he's going to take on Marshawn Lattimore, who actually held Cooks in check last week after getting burned by Stephon Diggs. But, I mean, overall, you look at Kelvin Benjamin's price tag, $6,700 on DraftKings for a guy who I don't see the upside with his passing attack. I get the matchup. Once again, I mean, I'm willing to be wrong on this. I just think Carolina, the upside is a little bit capped. I still like going some other directions. If they're just going to run the ball a ton with Jonathan Stewart, get Christian McCaffrey involved, guys like Kelvin Benjamin at $6,700, I'm not particularly thrilled with. I think that's a high price tag for him. $6,600 on FanDuel, sure, you can make that work. Obviously, it's a little bit easier to make a lineup over there. Benjamin's not as, the price dependent. I just, I'm okay with it. But overall, I'm not exactly thrilled, with these guys' spots. But I think they are worth mentioning if you're kind of going and building a lot of lineups. But, the guys I mentioned at the next tier above, I mean, I think there's, decent sized guys at better prices. So talking Oakland, Josh Norman, he's got to play. He's questionable coming into this week. I know he's got the joint issue. Huge upgrade, obviously, for Oakland if the passing attack is going up against the Josh Norman secondary. They already lost their starting safety. He's not expected to shadow Amari Cooper. That can change within the game if Cooper is completely burning him. But Crabtree lines up more on Norman's side, as we've seen kind of in previous numbers. So that means Cooper is going to see Breeland. Breeland's not a guy I don't want to shy away from. I think you can fire away with Cooper this week. I think Jared Cook's an intriguing option against a Washington team that's been burned by tight ends this year. Everyone's going to play Jack Doyle. Everyone's going to play Eric Ebron. Everyone's going to play Zach Ertz. I think Jared Cook's an interesting GPP option. I've talked about him a little bit here at DFC, so don't mind him. Stephon Diggs, another Vikings player. He does get the downgrade this week. Brent Grimes has actually been decent. He should see plenty of Diggs this week. 17% of the time. He only gets targeted 0.27 fantasy points per route run allowed. I mean, those are solid numbers from Grimes. With Case Keenum under center, I mean, we kind of just look at this Vikings offense and just kind of not really thrilling. I think Thielen's actually in a better spot if you are looking to be contrarian this week. Lockdown coverage. Let's talk about Alshon Jeffery. Love that DraftKings price, especially if Janoris Jenkins sits. He's at $5,900. Jenkins is questionable. He did miss practice once again. Going to get Ross Cockrell, who's filling in. That's not a guy that I do not mind shying away from at all. He used to play in Pittsburgh. Definitely like firing away against him. Jeffery, 1.78 yards per route run since last season. Obviously, he was hardly healthy. Giants secondary, very suspect when we get Jenkins out of play here, as we saw. So I don't mind going that route. But if Jenkins does play, I'm kind of off of Jeffery in general. Look at Mike Evans. He's going to get Xavier Rhodes treatment. Rhodes has just been a guy who I don't like targeting. I love Mike Evans. I love the huge size mismatch he brings. He's just a physical specimen that, you just toss up and he goes and gets balls. But I'd rather take a shot on DeSean Jackson and Waynes. You just look at Rhodes. I mean, only targets 17% of the time. Holds wide receivers to just a 47% catch rate, 0.20 fantasy points per route run. I'm not really loving the matchup for Evans this week. He's a potential fade. Marvin Jones, he's caught 2 touchdowns this year. That rate's not going to continue, especially this week against Desmond Trufant. Trufant's a guy who just doesn't get targeted only 13% of the time. Holds guys to under 0.25 fantasy points per route run. That's kind of an easy call there. I like Tate and Ebron much more in those matchups to pair with Stafford. If Norman plays, Michael Crabtree will see him a little bit more. I still think it's going to be on both of those. I think Cooper and Crabtree will both see some Norman at times as long as he plays. Crabtree, obviously, he's up in price now. We have to kind of just dissect these things a little bit more given his new price tag, obviously coming off a 3-touchdown game. Norman, he's hardly targeted, just 15% of the time, allows 0.21 fantasy points per route. Obviously, one of those corners that we just don't like to target against. So definitely a situation that we need to come in and kind of look here as we get closer into Sunday. A couple more guys here, 2 more. Tyreek Hill, going to see some Casey Hayward this week. Hayward's a guy I don't like targeting as well. He's one of the top 10 PFF corner grades. Chiefs, I know they like to move around Hill quite a bit. He's just one of those guys who does various things on the run. But Hayward, 0.23 fantasy points per run. Catch rate, just 57%. I think Hill's, just really a GPP dart throw at best. I'm not really going all in on him. And then we'll get to the final piece here. DeAndre Hopkins in a spot this week where we want to see if volume can trump matchup because, volume, it's going to be there. But if he's going to be doubled up, he's going to see Malcolm Butler, who's one of the better coverage corners in the game. This is just a spot where New England has held him in check before in bad passing situations. We have that here. Deshaun Watson is not a guy that, is capable of getting it done, but he's capable of certainly firing everything, that he gets and throwing it Hopkins' way. So, if you're playing Hopkins this week, it's solely for the value or solely for the targets because this is not really a good spot for Hopkins. We really wouldn't be looking his way if he wasn't getting 10+ targets a game. So, you can play him. I'm not going to have much exposure, but I can see just based off volume if you want to go that route. So that's going to wrap it up here. If I missed someone, if there's a name that you're looking at this week, you can definitely shoot one in the comment section. I'll give you a comment back, letting you know what I think. And once again, you can check out my article over on dailyfantasycafe.com. Is under the NFL article section and is a premium content. And good luck in week 3.